podcast for week 9. I am your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post this at BChat50. And getting right into things for the players that you need to be sitting this week, I'm going to start off with two guys who were likely first round or second round picks in fantasy drafts back in fantasy draft season. And Andrew Luck airing it out 42 plus times per game. Gotta like the volume. Gotta hate the matchup. The Broncos are the best pass defense in football. They held Aaron Rodgers to under 100 yards passing in Week 8. And Andrew Luck, by no measure, is Aaron Rodgers good this year or any year to this point in his career. So if they can hold Aaron Rodgers in check the way that they did, I don't like Andrew Luck's odds of succeeding against the secondary. Had his struggles with turnovers last week against the second stoutest pass defense in the game, featured by the Carolina Panthers, and don't like his odds with T.Y. Hilton and Donte Moncrief blanketed by the Aqib Talib and Corey Harris Jr. trio or duo at cornerback. So looks like a tough matchup. There are definitely 12 better starting quarterbacks that you can find this week, whether they're spot starters or your typical every week starters. Andrew Luck, just not a guy that should be started this week. The matchup is too tough. The Broncos are giving up under 200 yards per game passing, and they've allowed just 5 passing touchdowns this year. So this is a nightmare matchup for Luck, and I see no good reason for starting him. The other high pick that I'm going to advocate sitting is Eddie Lacy. Lacy's averaging just 55.7 yards from scrimmage per game, which is an awful total for a guy that, like I said, you likely had to spend a first-round pick on. It's one of the first running backs going off the board. He hasn't even made up for that with touchdown production, with just 2 touchdowns this year. I think his season can be best summed up by a question recently from Mike McCarthy about his conditioning and his playing weight these days recently in a press conference, to which Mike McCarthy didn't even dance around the question and say anything along the lines of, no, Lacy. He didn't try and hide the fact that Lacy's playing at a bigger weight and that he just doesn't look like the same back this year. And I think that tells you all you need to know. They've used James Starks a bit in the running game as well. Matchup isn't maybe as daunting as one would think. Panthers are an elite pass defense, but more of a middle-of-the-pack run defense, ranked 16th according to Football Outsiders. But Lacy just not doing enough to justify even starting as a flex these days. Got to have to show some signs of life before he can be trusted or have a very favorable matchup. And as we've seen, he had a matchup against the Chargers just a couple weeks ago where he blew it. He basically crapped the bed in terms of having a juicy matchup and still failing. And this is not a juicy matchup. So Eddie Lacy, keep him glued to your benches at this point. Moving back to that Indianapolis Colts offense, as I noted when I talked about Andrew Luck, his receivers are going to be blanketed. One of those receivers is Donte Moncrief. Moncrief has been excellent this year. He has 5 touchdown grabs, all of which came from Andrew Luck this year. And he's reeling in 4.5 receptions. He's been very good. He's really taken the leap in year 2 this season. But I'm not taking the only receivers that I'm going to be starting against the Denver Broncos secondary are your elite top shelf receivers. And even in those cases, I'm certainly going to question it. If I'm in a shallower league and I have some bench options, I can see cases for sitting even the stars against the secondary. Donte Moncrief not at that star level yet, so he is a pretty easy bench this week, especially if you have the stones to bench Andrew Luck as you should this week, then it should be pretty easy to bench one of his top receivers in Donte Moncrief. Next up is another guy who has played fairly well this year, but the matchup just isn't right. Jason Witten facing an Eagles defense that shuts down tight ends quite well. And he's working with a quarterback, Matt Castle, who's a game manager, which you would think would play to Witten's favor. But had a decent game 2 weeks ago against the Giants, but a clunker against the very giving Seattle Seahawks defense. And by very giving, I mean very giving to tight ends, not very giving as a whole. As you know, the Seahawks defense has been very good this year, but Jason Witten couldn't get his against a Seahawks defense that can't defend tight ends, facing an Eagles defense that can defend tight ends and defend the pass well in general. Don't like the matchup this week. I think you can find 10 to 12 tight ends that are better than him, including the guy that I'll highlight a little bit later in the podcast as a stardom, but also a guy like even Vernon Davis in his first game with the Broncos, I would feel more comfortable starting than Jason Witten this week, which probably seems a little bit crazy, but I'd rather have Davis working with Peyton Manning, even if this is zombie Peyton Manning at this point. Not last week, notwithstanding, Peyton looked great last week. Maybe that is a sign of things to come, but I'm more inclined to believe that Manning is somewhere between last week and probably a little closer to the rest of the season numbers. But I would take him, knowing Manning's track record with tight ends and Gary Kubiak's track record with tight ends. I would take Vernon Davis, even knowing a very limited bit of that playbook, only having a little bit to prepare for this weekend, over Jason Witten. So I think that should probably speak volumes about what I think of Witten this week. I just don't see him as a top 12 option at tight end. And until Tony Romo gets back, Witten's reserved for only juicy matchups, and even then he's going to have some potential to lay an egg. So go ahead and keep him on your bench this week. There are enough tight ends out there, even some streamer fodder that you can grab that's going to put up probably pretty similar production to Jason Witten. Moving on to the sunnier side of the podcast and the guys that you should be getting into your lineups, let's go right to Tyrod Taylor against the Dolphins. Taylor's passing numbers don't tell the entire story. He's averaging 219.4 yards passing per game, does have 9 touchdowns, has less than half as many interceptions, so he's taking care of the football. But he also adds an element with his legs, running the ball fairly well this year, and he carved up the Dolphins once before. He's making his first start in a few weeks. Bill's coming off the bye, sat 2 weeks before the bye with a knee injury. It's possible the knee injury could hamper him a little bit running, but I mean, he played with the knee injury and ripped off a remarkable touchdown run against the Titans with that knee hurt. So I'm not overly concerned that the knee's going to limit him from running. I think the matchup looks pretty good, and I mean, Taylor looked sharp earlier in the season. He may have all of his weapons save for Percy Harvin, who knows if or when he'll be back. But Sammy Watkins practicing this week at least a little bit. He's listed as questionable right now. Maybe he doesn't play, which would certainly hurt his stock. But Taylor really did a good job of utilizing Charles Clay earlier in the year and does have some other options at his disposal. Also has hopefully a fully healthy backfield this week with Carlos Williams likely back with Shady McCoy. So that offense coming together in terms of health, and that starts at the top with Tyrod Taylor. Next up is an injury fill-in at running back, and that's Jeremy Langford. Matt Forte nicked up last week, expected to miss a little bit of time. Jeremy Langford steps into a cushy situation, facing the worst run defense in football, according to Football Outsiders. The run defense that gives up the most fantasy points per game, according to Pro Football Reference. Anyway you slice it, the Chargers cannot defend running backs. Jeremy Langford's a rookie, was very productive at Michigan State, ran the fastest 40 time among running backs at the NFL Draft Combine, isn't a tiny back, does weigh over 200 pounds, does have some decent size. While I do think that the Bears will choose to lean on the passing game a little bit more heavily, and Langford won't get the Matt Forte treatment in terms of being force-fed the football, this is still a John Fox coach team, and Fox certainly loves to run the football and get his backs involved, and this matchup sets up very nicely for Langford. So he's a good play. He's a good start this week. If you were able to make that waiver claim and grab him, kudos to you. You got a productive back that I think can play like an RB2 at best, maybe at worst probably a high-end flex. So I'd say for a guy making his first start, the floor is considerably higher than most would expect from a rookie runner like that. Next up is Brandon LaFell. There's a little bit of speculation on my part in making this pick that he'll get a little bit of extra usage this week, but from a non-speculative standpoint, the Patriots have the biggest team over-under total this week, and it's not close. They have a 5-point edge over the second highest team total featured by the Saints. Saints check in with a 28-point team over-under total. Patriots are sitting at a whopping 33, so obviously the only team with a team over-under total north of 30. This team gets it done through the air primarily. Yeah, they'll use LeGarrette Blount at times, but they don't care about conventional offenses. They don't care about balance. They care about pummeling teams. They're 14-point favorites this week. If this game gets out of hand, now is the perfect time for Bill Belichick to game plan and get LaFell some extra reps in game situations. I mean, this isn't practice time. This is a chance to get him up to mid-season form in football shape after missing most of the season on the PUP list. This is just LaFell's third game back. Made strides from his first start to his second. Dropped 6 passes in his first start. Was sharper in his second start. Increased that volume this start, and you've got a guy who can be a weapon for a team that really all they should care about at this point is staying healthy and getting guys ready for the stretch run, because this is a playoff-bound team. I mean, they're undefeated right now. They look like the best team in football. And LaFell has a soft-ish matchup against the Redskins, who rank in the bottom half of the league in pass defense. We're not talking about one of the worst defenses, but they are below average, and that'll play in LaFell's favor. And LaFell was excellent last year in year one with the Patriots, set career highs across the board. So if he can get back to even close to that form, if he's 80% of what he was last year, that's a productive flex option or a wide receiver 3 this week. And finally, let's look at Heath Miller as your start at tight end. Coming off of a big game in which he caught 10 passes and surpassed 100 yards receiving, gets an even softer matchup this week against the Oakland Raiders, who, depending on your league scoring format, the Raiders are either the most giving or second most giving defenses from a fantasy points perspective to tight ends. Miller should easily carve this defense up. He and Ben Roethlisberger have been working well together for years. He is Big Ben's safety blanket, and with Le'Veon Bell out for the year, I would say that's even more the case now, because he doesn't have that back to just check down to. Miller should continue to see a steady dose of targets, and should even be game planned to get excess work this week, given the matchup and the fact that the Raiders just cannot stop tight ends. So I feel really good about saying start Heath Miller this week. Should be owned in a higher percentage of leagues, as I noted earlier in the week in the streaming podcast and the streaming article and waiver wire article. But if you own him, get him in there. There's only a handful of tight ends, basically Rob Gronkowski and the other elite tight ends at the position, that I would consider starting over Miller. And this week, if your flex allows for you to start a tight end and you happen to be an owner that has a Gronk-Miller pairing, you can actually use the two together. I would feel very comfortable with that. So get Heath Miller in your lineups this week. And on that note, that's going to wrap things up for the podcast. Check out all the great content at fantasyfootballcafe.com, where we've got articles and we've got a very active forum where you can get some advice or just chime in and have a discussion about fantasy football with some very intelligent, very active, very opinionated, and very fantasy football loving community there. So until next week, good luck this week. Get these guys in your lineups or out of your lineups, depending on where I highlighted them in today's podcast. And just win, baby.